The next order of the day is our Big Thinking Lecture, which of course is part of the Big Thinking Lecture series that takes place across Canada and has existed for more than 2 decades now. I want to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for their support over many years. Now, usually this takes place at a breakfast on the hill. We're a little off the hill today, but I hope not off kilter. Cet été, avec le dépôt du rapport sommaire de la Commission de vérité et réconciliation, tous les Canadiens ont été exhortés à agir et la Fédération prend très au sérieux cet appel à l'action. Le secteur des sciences humaines a un rôle à jouer, une responsabilité et se doit d'appuyer le processus de réconciliation et l'établissement des relations respectueuses avec les peuples des Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. Agir ainsi entraîne des répercussions pour nos institutions, nos lieux de travail et nos disciplines. Nous aborderons ce sujet plus longuement dans la discussion en groupe après le déjeuner. We're extremely fortunate today to have, for our Big Thinking Lecture, someone who brings passion and incredible insight to the topic of reconciliation, fueled, I think, in large part by personal experience. I just finished Wab Kinew's book, and I can vouch for the fact that it is powerful, deeply impressive as a piece of family history, if I may put it that way, but also a piece of history about all of our relationships in Canada. Wab Kinew is a celebrated musician, journalist, author. His latest book, The Reason You Walk, was published just this year. Wab, of course, is also contributing very directly to the task of reconciliation in our own community, serving as Associate Vice President for Indigenous Relations at the University of Winnipeg. Joignez-vous à moi pour accueillir Monsieur Wab Kinew.
Oh, miigwech. Eganish na and then we magani took Ubarakwet nigo, quick kibina scales out be tongue menu dish in a caz, Jugshan totem, Kagiwata Soniga Ming and Donje. Abache G can dump Pija ma Udawa Aking, Nimigochu Yago Goe, Bakan and Ishnabek, Pimataziwato Ma King, Kirigan ZB and Ishnabe. Is in a caso at Ogoe and Schnabik. Apache, Jikandam, Mishagua, Nongum, Canonde, Windaman, and them, and the Shawanje, Getche, Nibwakawat, Ogoe Gete and Schnabik. Shugadash Nongum, Kitagi Kandan. Anyway. Alors, je vais attendre pour les traducteurs pour faire leur travail. Puis, on va continuer après ça. I always like to begin in the language. You know, that's that was the lingua franca of what's now called Canada, from the St. Lawrence all the way to the Red River, for the first 200 years after contact. And so it's fitting that one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is for there to be more Indigenous language programs at post-secondary institutions, degree programs, diploma programs, and so on. So I always like to bring in one of the most widely spoken Indigenous languages, Anishinaabe, or the Ojibwe language, Saulteaux language. So I wanted to ask, just to kind of take the temperature of the room, who here is a strong advocate for Indigenous knowledge? All right. We'll see about that. I wanted to begin, well, this is a photo of my father, so obviously he's very important to me, as those who've had a chance to check out the book know. But he's picking a medicine there. You can see the root in his hand. And in our language, we call it wike. And it's used to treat the common cold or, you know, throat infections, things like that. It's also used as a painkiller. And I wanted to speak about this because I was listening to this podcast not too long ago, and these two guys on the podcast were like, ASA, you know, aspirin. How did we even discover that stuff? Well, here's one answer to how human beings discovered acetylsalicylic acid. So this medicine, the origin story of it amongst the Cree people is that one day, this Cree guy was down near the water, and he saw a muskrat that was gravely ill, gravely wounded. And he watched this muskrat dig up a root and then proceed to eat that root. And after he ate that root, a short time later, the muskrat regained his vitality, and he was well again. And so the Cree person said, we can use this medicine as one of our healing plants, healing roots. That's Indigenous knowledge, right? So for everybody, and this question goes especially to everybody who put their hand up a minute ago. If I were to come up to you and tell you, hey, look at this new medicine I developed, and it was, double-blind, placebo, controlled lab, peer-reviewed, all this stuff, you should use it, what would you say? Probably, yeah, for sure. If I came up to you and I said, hey, look at this medicine, you should use it, and you said, well, how did you find out about it? Well, I was watching this muskrat eat it. That is the fundamental clash of worldviews that we are now tasked with dealing with as we engage in the process of indigenizing the university. Because let's really get down to it. Why is one better than the other? Right? They're both based on observation. They are both transmitting knowledge down through time. It's just that one is transmitted in the form of peer-reviewed journals, and the other is transmitted through an oral history. Right? So that is a task that lays before us. Incidentally, the Ojibwe origin story for this medicine is a little bit different. It is that one day an Ojibwe guy went down to the lake. He saw a Cree guy watching a muskrat. Cree guy said, hey, should I try it? And he said, yeah, go for it. Cree guy was okay, and so the Ojibwe guy said, yes, we can use this medicine. A very sacred story. Yeah, but that dichotomy between those two paradigms, those two worldviews, that is at the heart of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings, right? When they presented their report, this didn't get reported in the media, but I was in the room, and Justice Sinclair essentially, one of the key points that he made that day is that there is a myth of cultural superiority with respect to Indigenous cultures held by the mainstream, right? And he said that this is the consistent element that unites what's going on in this country today, that permeates the negative aspects of the relationship with Indigenous people. It is what was the ideological underpinning or the foundation for the residential school era, and it even goes as far back as the Papal Bulls, the doctrine of discovery, which held that non-Catholics couldn't own their own land, and therefore the dispossession of them was justified, right? And so they said we still see this in this country today. One example that they used was in the child welfare system, where they said child welfare agencies to this day continue to view Aboriginal poverty as a sign of parental neglect rather than as the result of failed government policies of the past, right? One example of how the myth of cultural superiority continues to play out to this day. So I think if you asked any of us, in polite conversation, are you guilty of cultural superiority, very few of us would confess to it. But myself, when I use that example of the muskrat and I look in my own heart, I see a bias against Indigenous culture and Indigenous knowledge. And I grew up in the culture. I grew up with the pipe. I grew up with the sweat. I grew up with the Sundance. I grew up with the midday wind. So if I see a bias, when I look at other people in this country, I imagine that there's still some work to be done. So I just wanted to start by putting that out there and have us be aware of our biases. So we are in this era of reconciliation. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report should be required reading for everybody. The executive summary, anyway, should be required reading for everybody in this country, especially those of us in the post-secondary sector. But it's important that we don't, get too far ahead of ourselves, because, reconciliation is a buzzword in this country today. In the post-secondary sector, indigenization is a buzzword, right? But as I was reminded by Eugene Arcand, residential school survivor, don't forget about the survivors, right? So sometimes we get so attached to our own projects and so attached to our own initiatives that we forget about the people who brought us to the dance in the first place. And in my case, that's the guy in the back row there, who looks a lot like me. His name is Tabasanequit. So he experienced the horror stories of which you are by now aware of. You know, terrible forms of abuse and neglect. And because of the research of Dr. Ian Mosby, we also know that he and the hundreds of other kids at St. Mary's in the late 40s and early 50s were also a part of nutritional experiments which were conducted by federally government-funded scientists, right? And so an additive to flour, which was banned from use in this country at the time with human beings, was tested on these children, and then dental care was denied to them because the researchers were afraid that it might interfere with the results of their study. So that's something else we have to confront, is that, you know, that is the history of the academy in many Indigenous communities. Right? These academicians came in and they saw starving children and they didn't think, let's feed these kids. They thought, let's design a controlled experiment to run on them. And so we have to acknowledge that past and figure out how do we remove the hangover of that in our practice today. And so for us, in our community, it's the intergenerational impacts, right? So in my own family, it has to do with the negative personality traits that I continue to exhibit as a parent to this day. Like, I'm a great dad in most aspects, you know, hockey coach, and taking my sons with me all around the world, traveling all over the place, super active in their schoolwork and all that. But I know that I'm too quick to temper. I know that I'm too impatient with them. Sometimes make a cutting remark might be harmful to their self-esteem. And that's what writing the book really was instructive for me in, is that I reflected on how these people made my father feel, powerless and angry, how he made me feel, again, powerless and angry, though I didn't experience anything as bad as what he did. And now that I'm raising that generation, I'm repeating too much of those learned behaviors. And so we have to, as Indigenous people, come to terms with that, because, you know, the government's not going to do that for us, nor would it be appropriate for them to do so. At the same time, there are ingrained attitudes towards the academy, towards education in general, that were picked up in the residential school era. And some of those contribute to the inertia in trying to close the education gap in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And then on the part of the mainstream, there is still a lack of knowledge about Indigenous culture, Indigenous rights, you know, and a lack of understanding of what happened in the residential school era, right? Even to this day. A huge segment of Canadians don't know what happened in residential schools. And among those who claim to know, there are still too many people who deny the truth of what happened. And they say, like, yeah, we know it was bad, but, you know, that's what everybody did at the time. Really? Electric chairs? Really? Nutritional experiments? Really? No. What happened in residential schools is unique, even amongst the boarding schools of past eras. Right? So we have to acknowledge the truth before we can move on. So what the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission really lead to, like, I think almost half of them deal with education. There's a shortened link, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to download the PDF. You can do so right there. But the ones that apply to the post-secondary sector, you know, have to do with a few recommendations, like adding Indigenous language programs. The edict that SHRC should create a new research program for advancing the understanding of reconciliation. But then there's some that I think apply to universities and colleges a little bit more obliquely. For instance, commemoration. Commemorating what happened to residential school survivors should probably play a role in that. Commemorating the 150th anniversary of Confederation in a way that isn't just like some sort of like rose-colored view of John A. Macdonald, who for many people is the father of Confederation, but in my community is the father of genocide, right? But of doing a more realistic and a more inclusive retrospective of these past 150 years. And I would argue that, historians, people in Indigenous studies, right? People in the humanities should play a huge part in trying to mediate. How do we present that history in a way that's accurate, captures the goodness of what happened in this country, but also presents a realistic portrait. But I think probably the way in which the TRC report is being thought of in most educational institutions and in a big chunk of the public sector, and also increasingly in the private sector, are the calls to action which say that mid-career professionals should get a baseline of knowledge in Indigenous culture, contemporary issues, history, and also that new teachers, new lawyers, new health professionals, nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians, also get that baseline of knowledge. Really, the TRC reports that everybody in Canada, whether you work in the public sector, the private sector, you're in one of the professions, you should get a baseline of knowledge about Indigenous peoples. So where's that going to come from? Right? Like that should be the area in which the post-secondary institutions step up and say, yeah, we have ways, and we're prepared to work with you. And so specifically, if you just think very linearly about where the humanities and the social sciences are teaching, the areas in the TRC report that they recommend teaching about are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the treaties, Aboriginal rights and title, residential schools, anti-racism, intercultural understanding, and so on. But I think we could think about it more broadly as well and recognize that we probably have a role to play in reaching out to many of the other sectors that are recommended there. And then finally, one of the other recommendations is that it's probably interpreted by most people as being a recommendation for government to establish a National Council for Reconciliation. But if you dig deeper into what that call to action means and what it's about, it is about setting benchmarks on socioeconomic indicators for Indigenous people so that you can measure the progress of reconciliation. And I would argue that the post-secondary institutions, in terms of retention, attrition, recruitment of Indigenous students, have a role to play in the public reporting of those data sets so that we can track reconciliation. And also that in the research of academics, right? There's probably a huge value to what you guys can contribute in your own specific fields to the understanding of where there are socioeconomic gaps and where those gaps are closing in this country. So I think there's a ton to chew on in the TRC report for the humanities and the social sciences. And I think it is a fantastic, well thought out roadmap for what we can do as individuals, but also as collectives to contribute towards reconciliation. So I wanted to share with you a few examples of how we're responding at the University of Winnipeg. This is a massive online course geared towards the private sector. So it is to provide that baseline of knowledge to somebody in the energy sector, somebody in the financial sector, maybe even somebody in government. And unlike other online courses where it's just like a PowerPoint with a voiceover, this is designed to look more like something you'd watch on YouTube or Netflix or on TV. And so it has a mixture of high-profile voices like Dr. Borrows there from the University of Victoria, to community people like Shannon Kustachin, leaders like Murray Sinclair, and then also corporate leaders like Jim Boucher from Fort Mackay. And again, the best way to learn about Indigenous culture is to do a deep dive and spend time in the communities, days, weeks. But that's probably not realistic for an organization with 2,000 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people. So for those people who are most actively engaged with Indigenous communities, they should spend that time. But this is geared more towards, the accountant in the office tower who's never actually going to deal one-on-one with a First Nations community. They can still be furnished with some baseline of knowledge. And then some of our faculty have designed a facilitation guide to accompany it. And yeah, he just built this whole like pedagogically sound approach to complementing the videos. So after you watch the video, come into like a group setting, say the one on natural resources. Half the group, you're taking the First Nations perspective. The other half of the group, you're taking the industry proponent perspective. Come up with the arguments for your position, come up with the arguments for your position. Now engage in dialogue and try and sort it out, right? And through that sort of group activity, be able to kind of really work into your heart and into your mind what some of these issues are all about. So that's around some of the, I guess, recommendations to teach mid-career professionals. In terms of teaching the next generation of leaders, at the University of Winnipeg, we're moving towards implementing an Indigenous course requirement at the undergraduate level. So it's actually going to be decided on Friday. You know, the Senate at U of W is going to decide whether or not to move ahead with this. But it's been approved in principle. And so the idea is, if it gets final approval, starting next academic year, everybody coming in to the U of W in, you know, arts, sciences, business, education would have to do one Indigenous course during the degree program. So we're talking about 1/30th of a 3-year degree, 1/40th of a 4-year degree. So it's not like, you know, the world's coming to an end in any way, but it's a start, you know. Maybe in the Q&A, if you guys are interested, we could talk more about the structure of it. But essentially, it was a student-led initiative. So you see the past UWSA, so Student Association President, and then Aboriginal Student Council, co-representative there. Started with the students, they brought it forward, Senate approved it in principle, and then in the interim, faculty, students, and then a few other admin people such as myself have been working together on designing what it would actually look like. And so we feel pretty confident that it's in good shape and that it meets the requirements of the university and also respects faculty academic freedom and student autonomy. But of course, try saying the word requirement at a university. You can imagine that there's some pushback, right? And so I would divide broadly the pushback to the Indigenous course requirement into two camps. There's sort of like the unrealistic, irrational, racist pushback, which I don't really spend too much time engaging with. I'm not gonna, you know, win that argument on the Winnipeg Sun comment section. But there are what I would say more legitimate critiques, more legitimate complaints, right? And some of them come from, you know, faculty. Some of them come from other people in the university community, and some are logistical criticisms, and we kind of get around those relatively easily. But some I do think are good learning opportunities, good teaching opportunities. So, for instance, one is like the slippery slope argument, right? Which is that, oh, is this Indigenous course requirement just like a slippery slope? Next thing you know, there's going to be a LGBTIQ requirement, and then there'll be a newcomer requirement, and then pretty soon you have 90 credit hours or 120 credit hours that's all like aimed, totally required, totally prescribed, all aimed at different social justice priorities, right? To which, like, first of all, I'd say, like, if you're going to say that, maybe you could use a LGBTIQ refresher. But not to diminish in any of those other points, you have to understand that Indigenous people occupy a unique space in this country, in the political landscape, in the cultural landscape, right? And that's why requiring a baseline of knowledge about Indigenous people makes sense. Like, we're the only group in the country who has a unique class of constitutional rights, for example, Aboriginal and treaty rights, right? Well, wait a second, how can there be a broad equality in Canadian law, all people are equal, and yet there's one class of people who have a unique set of rights? If you don't understand that, that's why an Indigenous course requirement makes sense, right? And then bear in mind the truth and the history that the TRC has revealed, you know, this blind spot in Canadian history of the contributions that Indigenous people have made. And the fact that reconciliation is a public priority in this country today. Well, what we're trying to do as a liberal arts school is prepare people more than to just be automatons in the workplace, more than just, provide them with a skill, right? We're also trying to prepare them to be good citizens. And part of what it means to be a good citizen in this part of the world is to know a little bit about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous language, Indigenous culture. It's in our name. We are the University of Winnipeg, right? University of Cree name, right? Of an Indigenous territory, of Treaty 1 land, of the Métis heartland, right? And so I think some of those conversations have actually been very positive in the end. They've been, tense at times, but they've been opportunities to engage in a meaningful discussion about reconciliation. And I don't expect anything in the academy to get a free pass, right? Like, it's going to be examined critically no matter what. And so that's sort of some of the points that we've been dealing with. So I wanted to close the story on my father's experience, because I think it's illustrative in a few ways. I spoke a bit about the pain and the trauma and, the intergenerational legacy. But it would be a mistake to view his story as one of pain and suffering. Really, his story is one of inspiration and positivity. And though he was, a stern figure growing up, and he had his own issues with anger, by the end of his life, he emerged as a fully formed human being. So what you see in this photo is a day in early 2012 when he adopted the Archbishop of Manitoba as his brother in a traditional adoption ceremony. And so on that day, that became my Uncle Jimmy. Yeah. And then they built a relationship with one another, right? And going out to lunch and, doing whatever it is that old men do together. I really don't really have any insight into that yet, but yeah. And so it was amazing on one level, on the level of, humanity, and on the level of what it means to be a good person. Because here was somebody who had a right to be angry or a right to, carry thoughts of retribution. Instead, rising above those feelings and embracing that person that he could have directed his rage at, instead with love and with kindness and compassion. And that's a remarkable example of how to be a human being. But if you think about it, the genius of what my father did on that day is that it happened in an Indigenous ceremony, in a traditional Indigenous building, in the context of Indigenous culture. So it wasn't a research project, but he did exercise an Indigenous methodology into his task there, right? And so you had the black robe wrapped in a star blanket. And when the honor song was being sung, he was doing the powwow two-step and lifting up an eagle feather, right? And so that's what reconciliation can look like. It can be something very tangible, something very practical, something very real. A method by which we deliver two real people towards learning about one another, towards building a real relationship with one another. And it doesn't always have to occur within the boundaries of our current imagination, right? We can use other mechanisms to deliver us to this place, including ones that come to us from Anishinaabe and Nehiyaw and Mi'kmaq and Kwakwaka'wakw and Nuu-chah-nulth and many other Indigenous cultures. So when I think about it, reconciliation, I know it's often sometimes scary or something that's viewed with skepticism, but I really look at it as an opportunity, right? Like, here we are in this historic moment in this country with a chance to get things right. And what are we committed to? You know what I mean? In professional life, but also in personal life. Like, I'm a firm believer that we ought to be committed to truth-telling, right? And I'm a firm believer that telling the truth always makes you stronger. And it may be difficult, and it may force us to confront aspects of the story we've been telling ourselves that are dark, or that we've been, putting off, or that are, challenging. But it is through working through those tough challenges. It is through learning a bit about one another. It is through surmounting our own biases, so we become more complete. We become, more acquainted with the full truth and the accurate truth. And so I would encourage all of you in as much as you have influence over what is taught, to remember that the story of residential school survivors isn't just a story of heartbreak and a story of loss. It's also the story of how one generation in this country surmounted inhumanity and showed that best side of our human nature in response. And they stood up and they demanded justice of this country. And though they came from the most marginalized, the most politically disenfranchised communities in this country, and though it took them decades to do so, they were successful. It was not perfect, right? But they did achieve some measure of justice. And the real gift that they've given us is that they didn't use that as an opportunity to drive a wedge between communities. They've taken that as a chance to bring people together. So the challenge, I think, for each of us, no matter what sector we're in, is to figure out what we can do to operationalize reconciliation, to achieve reconciliation. And it just so happens that the educational project in general, but I would argue post-secondary institutions in particular, have one of the most critical roles to play in this project of reconciliation. So with that, I'll say, Miigwech Kipizindawayek, Kina Naskumit Na Kakia, Wilaliok, and thank you guys very much for listening to me. Sure.
Thank you very much. I'm not even going to make a comment because I want to give as much time as possible for questions. Question, commentaire, please. We've got about 10 or so minutes. Wab has to catch a plane. So please go to one or another of the microphones. Thanks very much. And just give us a sense of who you are. Thank you. Nelson.
Hi. I'm Erica Lehrer. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Museum and Heritage Studies at Concordia University. I noticed that you had an image of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in your video, and I just wondered if, given the mandate for commemoration as one of the things that the TRC is recommending, do you think that museums in Canada have a role that the Academy can work together with to realize those goals?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think commemoration will probably take many different forms. There's actually, in discussion right now, one plan is to put a monument on Parliament Hill in commemoration of residential school survivors and towards reconciliation. I think that would be great. Human Rights Museum has been a little bit challenging because there's been tremendous government interference in their collection, and so they have not really embraced the term genocide or cultural genocide. They kind of put in quotation marks. My sister, who's a PhD candidate in art history at Harvard, she put it in a really good perspective for me. She said, it doesn't matter what the government of today is doing, they'll be gone someday. She was right, She says that museum will be there for 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. Just stay at the table, just keep working with them, keep conversing with them, and in time, they'll get it right. They'll get the content right. So I think that would be my overall view of it, is that let's engage in the conversations. Let's remember that, for sure, academics have a role at the table, but the residential school survivors need to be there. The Indigenous community needs to be there. And if we can design a process by which all those people are at the table, spending time together will be good, and we will be able to get it right. And we will be able to make sure that places like the Museum for the Human Rights, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and other centers like that are telling an accurate and holistic picture of what occurred.
Being right on their doorstep, does UW have any engagement with the museum?
There's a few, I guess, people whose personal research overlaps with the museum. I would say it's maybe beginning, and there'll be more of it in the future. Right now, the museum is mainly a site for meetings and stuff like that. They do have a great exhibit, and I think the design of the museum is very effective at delivering you to a place of contemplation about human rights. But I think they need more curatorial staff, and they need probably more assistance from the academic world and hopefully UW can do more of that in the future. Yeah.
I think we'll take 2 questions, if you don't mind, and then Wab will go for those. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Andrew Dean. I'm Vice President of Research at Lakehead University. So last year we introduced the same kind of thing of a mandatory Indigenous course, and it didn't get much pushback. I must admit I was pleased by that, and it got through Senate just fine. But where we did get some discussion and debate was whether or not that had to be a course that was Indigenous knowledge for Canada, whether or not a course that really dealt with Indigenous people of New Zealand or South Africa would be sufficient. In the end, we said no. It had to have a Canadian content. And I wonder if a similar debate has gone on in Winnipeg.
Because that's so specific, let's just go ahead. Yeah, thanks.
Well, because I would actually say my question is related, so maybe we get both questions up here.
Okay.
Gage Averill, I'm the Dean of Arts at UBC, and we've had this debate. Our Indigenous scholars are resistant to the notion of a requirement, and I'll just capture their argument quickly. We could add that to this this discussion. They've said, we've built Indigenous programs primarily with Indigenous or Aboriginal scholars, very high focus on research. What we would get with a mass requirement for 50,000 students is students who, to get back to pushback, students who have ignorant opinions and worldviews who would resist and, in fact, probably become more resistant by being forced to take a requirement. 2, you'd have a small number of Aboriginal students in large classes of people who don't have an understanding of sophisticated or sensitive understanding of Aboriginal issues, with the possibility of increasing alienation amongst Aboriginal students as a result, and that you'd either have to have courses offered by large numbers of non-Aboriginal, in some cases not well-prepared scholars, or go on a sort of mass hiring, which is unrealistic for many institutions at the same time. That's I think, captures their concerns. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I think this is a very, very important issue.
So the Indigenous scholars were concerned that you might hire more Indigenous scholars?
No, I know. Well, to teach, yeah,
creating a straw man of your point.
Indeed, no, they'd love us all to add more scholars, but I think the idea of trying to staff courses for 50,000 students looks daunting to them.
Yeah, well, I think there's many different approaches, right? You could do an online course, right? And we do. Massive courses in other areas, right? Like academic writing, for instance, at the University of Winnipeg is another requirement. Just to respond quickly, yeah, we agreed that it should be local, right? Because the rationale for it is the rationale that the TRC report gave, right? That you have to understand what happened here. And so we need to broaden it out a little bit. We can't say Canadian context because many of the Indigenous nations in Canada, like say the Squamish, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Mohawk, the Mi'kmaq, they live on both sides of the American-Canadian border. So we can't cut it off by the Canadian border, but we should focus on the local context, maybe define more broadly as the North American context, right? So that was the same sort of thing that we arrived at. What I would say, I think all the points that I'm hearing raised by the faculty that you mentioned, they all kind of, I don't think they're realistic. If you want something done, you mandate it. You do, in the real world, if you want things to happen, you do 2 things. You mandate it, and then you put resources behind it. That's just the way things operate, right? And so, I understand that, yeah, it would, take it from a guy who was the only Native guy in the economics program at University of Manitoba. I know what it's like to be the only Indigenous student in a classroom with non-Indigenous people. But so what? This is what reconciliation looks like. We can't just be like, oh, I'm taking my basketball and going home because it's not going to be perfect. We have to get involved in the messy and sometimes imperfect process of what these mechanisms can look like. And so I think that while all those concerns are valid, and they may be borne out in the real world, I would much rather have every med student in this country get an Indigenous course as part of their program than not. I would much rather have every future engineer get exposure to Indigenous culture than not. And I know that it'll be imperfect and it'll be bumps along the way, but we should have faith that the overall project is good and that our staffs or admin supports are good enough to be able to help mediate some of those conflicts. And then with respect to the content criticism that was raised, I think we made a conscious decision that the evaluation of what fulfills the Indigenous course requirement would go through the existing course approval process, right? And so what the existing course approval process is that any time a department outside of the one proposing the course is implicated, it gets sent to that department for review. So right now, if there's a course in science that has Indigenous content in it, right, that's being submitted to Senate for approval, it will go to Indigenous Studies for review and comment, right? And then Indigenous Studies sends it back. And so that will continue to exist in the new Indigenous course requirement process. The other, I guess, governance mechanism that we have at the U of W is the Indigenous Advisory Circle. So this is a collective of traditional knowledge keepers. This is a collective of some Indigenous academics from outside the U of W, and then some community leaders. And it's sort of our way to take the temperature of the Indigenous community, and they advise the president and myself about, direction for the university. And so they will also have a role to play in evaluating the course content, and they won't infringe on Senate autonomy by deciding what is or does not fulfill the Indigenous course requirement, but they'll have a say. And then it'll be up to the president as a senator to bring that voice into the Senate discussion, right? So I think that we, and I don't know the exact name, but I know UBC has similar sort of tables such as that. So I think that we can design processes that at once respect academic freedom, but also ensure that the content will be strong enough so that regardless of how they're delivered, whether they're in large lectures or seminars or online courses, that it will be sufficient to kind of meet the goals and the rationale that we're trying to hit here.
Great. Thanks. Wonderful talk.
We have time
right,
for one
thank you.
last question.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Rob, for your talk. That was wonderful. My name is Lynn Wells. I'm the Vice President Academic at First Nations University of Canada, and you can probably tell by looking at me that my whole working life is an attempt to understand and to reconcile. I'm very grateful to work where I work. I wanted to speak to two things. First of all, the commemoration issue, and I want to acknowledge our board member, Claudette Commanda. Our board and our president have been working with survivors to create a concept for a national gathering place for reconciliation. And we always say a national gathering place because we understand that there will be many, but we are...
Yeah, UBC is going to have a building, U of M has one. Yeah.
There's lots of room for many things, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody at lunch who would like to see. I have some of our concept drawings. But what I wanted to pick up on from your talk was the National Council for Reconciliation. You said that that's not really the work of government, or may not be the work of government. Do you think it's the work of universities? And if so, can this group be part of creating that council?
I think, yeah, I think Universities Canada or individual universities could definitely get in the ear of the new government and say that that's a priority. Just to reiterate, I think what I was trying to say in the talk is that it is the role of government to set up the National Council for Reconciliation, but that academics and that, collectives of academics have a role to play in that as well, particularly around the reporting and the creation of, data sets to inform that process. But yeah, I think behind the scenes, it would be great if, universities and academics wanted to tell the new minister and the new government that that's an important piece. And she's already signaled, I think there was just a story last night or this morning in the Globe, Carolyn Bennett was saying that, she wants her civil servants to report back by Canada Day 2017 on the progress that is being made to close socioeconomic gaps. And that's good. So she's thinking in the same way. But having that council and a specific commissioner for reconciliation in place would be better, because then it'd basically be like an auditor general for reconciliation who could, with independent eyes and, a little bit of autonomy, be able to say, well, you fudged the data, or, you still have to focus on this area, well, that area looks good, don't distract from this and that. So yeah, so in spite of the new government's tone and, the optimism that I feel, I'm still realistic, and so I think those, impartial mechanisms informed by, good, solid research, I think would be hugely beneficial.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So Wab ended his talk by emphasizing the importance of truth-telling, and I can certainly say, having read his book, that he actually, in that overused terminology, walks the walk. He tells a lot of truth about his own life, his own struggles, and I think it's a great way of helping us understand the struggles that each and every one of us is going to face in this moment of possible reconciliation. And it also talks about the truth that's necessary in our institutions. And we saw some really pragmatic ways in which we can confront and address that truth. So Wab, on behalf of everyone here at the Federation, I want to say thank you for a genuinely challenging, moving, but also pragmatic talk. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, great.